Hello, this is Professor Congleton, and this course is EC411 Moral Foundations of Capitalism. And this particular lecture is Neoclassical Economics and Ethics, Part 2. Part 1 I recorded because I was going to be away at attending 2 academic conferences, and I did so, but in the way, in the course of attending those conferences, I wound up picking up COVID-19, and rather than bring my COVID germs to you in class today, I thought it would be better if I recorded the lecture. Now I have a mild form, so you won't see me coughing or sneezing, with luck. But nonetheless, I test positive, and I've tested positive for several days, so I'm here in my basement recording the lecture instead of presenting it to you in class. So what we're going to do today is continue the work that was started in the first recording. We're going to start off by talking about the supply of ethical individuals. In the previous lecture, we just assumed that the supply was changing for one reason or another. Some kind of exogenous shock changes the number of people with productive ethical dispositions, and that had effects that ripple through the economy through effects on the quality of the services, the quality of the goods that people were able to buy it in markets, and therefore on the quantities of those goods that the people would buy. And as more goods were purchased, specialization increased, and the two effects together basically lower the cost of goods and services to people throughout the economy and tend to promote economic development. Okay, now we're going to kind of step back and try to think a little bit more about what kinds of factors are likely to generate the ethical dispositions that we actually see in people in a given society at a given time. And then we're going to talk about how changes in market conditions might affect those dispositions indirectly. We did that in the previous series of material in Chapter 3, when by looking at a matrix and showing how a change in the market premiums for particular types of dispositions might change an individual's investment. And so all we're doing this time is a simpler problem of just looking at how the rate of return on a particular ethical disposition might be affected by market conditions. And I've lost my nice eraser. I don't know quite where it went, so I'm using this more primitive one, and I have to put it somewhere in order to have space on the board for the writing. Okay, so what I'm going to do is say that let's suppose that the philosophical material we covered in Part 1 of the course is actually jointly reasonable. That is, that people are affected partly by an interest in virtue. Okay, this is Aristotle's idea, right? That virtue actually enhances the quality of life generally, and therefore people who are virtuous tend to be happier on average than people who are not. Right? So you invest in virtuous dispositions because it increases your self-esteem, and that's a sufficient reason to make some investment. The other possible reason might be Smith's reason. Right, and remember that Adam Smith argued that people invest in virtuous dispositions because it attracts praise. It makes them praiseworthy individuals. And praiseworthiness itself is something that's intrinsically demanded by human nature, and it's something that, if not intrinsically rewarded by others, it often is so. And therefore you undertake moral conduct and develop moral habits of thought and conduct because of the praise that people give you for certain kinds of activities and the disapprobation that they give you for others, right? That discourages less than praiseworthy activities or immoral activities. Right, so that's another source of marginal benefits you could get from behaving ethically. And then Third, think of the economic marginal benefits of developing a particular disposition. At least one, in this case, one that is increasing your marketability as a labor supplier. All right, so this might be called Ben Franklin's rationale for ethics. That ethics makes your life easier, makes you more able to interact with other people in a friendly and polite way, and it tends to enhance your market activities because people find you to be more trustworthy, willing to loan you money for investments, and also more willing to purchase your products. Right, so all three of these different ideas could be simultaneously true, in which case the benefits you get from investing in an ethical disposition is the sum of these three curves. So this might be the quantity of an ethical disposition invested in by, say, our person named Al. And this would be dollars per unit, whatever that would be. And to do the sum, we want to add them vertically because you get these benefits simultaneously. So you add this height to that height, that gives you up to here. And then you add that height to that, and you're off my little whiteboard. And basically, you're going to get a curve that looks kind of like that. Right, so the total benefit of acquiring an ethical disposition that markets reward, and which others in the community find praiseworthy, and which you yourself find to be admirable in some sense, is a much steeper, more vertical line than any one of these three by themselves. And if you think that it's only one of the three that matters, then you can focus on that one. There's not a problem there. Now, there's some kind of opportunity cost to investing in these moral dispositions. You could be doing things for fun. You could be working on a job. If you assume that that you can't be doing lots of things simultaneously, and that this effort to make the investment in ethical dispositions is somehow separate from the others, it makes the diagram easier to draw. And so that's the assumption we're going to make. And so basically, we're just going to assume there's some kind of opportunity cost. Oops. Sorry, I can't read that one myself, so I'll clarify it. Okay, and so we use the regular rational choice model to think about how much of an investment an individual would make. And he will invest in more of this ethical disposition as long as the marginal benefits from it exceed the marginal cost of acquiring it. And so if the person we're interested in gets benefits from all three of these types of vectors, or these sources, then the quantity that will be invested in will be M star. Right, that will be his kind of moral disposition in this particular dimension of his moral theory. If he only gets the economic reward, he would invest back here. If he only gets the social reward, the Smithian reward of praise, he'll invest up to here. And if he only gets the Aristotelian reward, self-esteem reward, he invests out to here. So if all three are active, he's going to invest, or this person's going to invest more in ethical dispositions, or this particular ethical disposition than not, okay, than he would otherwise. Now notice if there's no economic source of reward, he'll invest less than if there are economic advantages as well. Okay, so for people who've had public economics, you should recognize this. This looks a lot like the pure public goods diagram that we drew, but its purpose here is quite different than a pure public goods diagram, and that's because this is meant to be an individual's own calculation, own assessment of how much effort in acquiring a particular moral disposition is worthwhile. So it's entirely a private good, although once he has developed that disposition, you could say that his behavior will have some positive externalities in many cases. But that's not being taken into account in this calculus. Okay, at this point I'd say any questions or comments, and you would have some. And what we're doing next is to think, okay, well, what happens if circumstances change? Okay, so let's basically just redraw that diagram. Okay, so I've redrawn the diagram, labeled it slightly, just slightly differently along the horizontal axis, as the strength of a moral disposition rather than the quantity of a moral disposition, which I think is a better label. And then we want to think, okay, a little bit about what happens if the reward increases in some sense, right? So the reward from an ethical disposition could change because praise increases, because your sense of self-satisfaction with having that moral disposition increases, or because of economic rewards changing. All right, so we have three factors that can generate the change in ethical dispositions. In principle, for this section of the class, I guess we're most interested in the economic effect. And so it probably is intuitively obvious that if the economic reward goes up, this whole curve shifts out a little bit, it rotates a little bit, and when it rotates, the end result will be that the strength of moral dispositions in this economically rewarded area will tend to increase. So what's that look like in this diagram? Okay, I'm going to keep them all coming out of the axis at the same point. It just makes it a little bit easier. So this would be the effect of an increase. And the result will be a little change as drawn in the sum. And the investment of this particular moral disposition, in this particular moral disposition, will increase. Right, and so if you think about it, there are two things going on here. One is that the extent of the moral disposition that we find in a given community is partly determined by economic factors, at least at the margin. But on the other hand, if we buy into Smith's idea and to Aristotle's idea, and we think those are actually more important than the economic reinforcement of those particular dispositions, then we would say that the economic effect is really small compared to the overall investment, because those other factors, the praise and the self-esteem, are more important determinants of that ethical disposition. Now, you can disagree with the order I've got them up here. You might be with Ben Franklin, thinking the economic rewards are the main ones, the most important ones. Or you might be with Aristotle, thinking it's really all self-esteem and the other ones are really very small. Or like Smith, arguing that the praise and the pursuit of praiseworthiness are really more important than the other two, and therefore the other two are really pretty small. So what's neat about the diagram is it lets you imagine different mixes of these rewards from accumulating a particular ethical disposition, and to think about how it would affect the choices of individuals. Now, for our purposes, once you've got your particular mix in a satisfactory way for yourself, it's still true, no matter what it is, if it includes an economic reward, then when those reward changes at the margin, the rational investor in moral dispositions will change his investment a little bit. Okay, maybe not a huge amount, but at least to some extent. So what can change this line, this economic reward? Changes in technology, for example. Some technologies tend to increase the value of some ethical dispositions, and others tend to decrease that value. And which effect you get just depends on the economic innovation that takes place. So, for example, if you're working in an assembly line, and assembly lines started to become commonplace around 1900. Okay, initially I guess they were worked out for some military purposes, but they were extended to other types of goods and services shortly thereafter in the late 19th century. Henry Ford is famous for developing an assembly line method of producing the Model T, which made them much cheaper than most other vehicles at that time. Well, in an assembly line, it's really important that everybody does their job. If somebody screws up, it messes up everybody else in the line and reduces the effectiveness of that form of production. Right. So types of dispositions, moral dispositions, or the type of a work ethic that you might have, it becomes, in a sense, more important in this assembly line situation than in the earlier, more or less one person, each person being an independent producer by themselves. And so firms might have been willing to pay a premium for individuals who they thought would have a really strong work ethic if they were placing them on the assembly line. And Ford did that. He actually did pay a premium to people who came and worked for him. And he was relatively well known for that. And it makes perfect sense if you imagine the interaction between people along an assembly line, that you want a lot of people who could be counted on to do a good job quickly and throughout the day, and not have to worry about people shirking along the way, because it would foul up the whole assembly process. There are also innovations that tend to reduce the need for ethical dispositions. So, for example, a lot of the inventions about collecting money at the cash register tend to make it less important to have really honest people at the cash register, because it became because those innovations made it much easier to monitor what was going on at the individual running the cash register. You know, they would know every transaction that took place. They would know how much money was in there in the beginning. They know how much money is at the end, and they can pretty well know who's responsible for different shortages in the amount of money that should be there, based on all the transactions that were entered into the machine. And so one factor that can generate a change in ethical dispositions would be, economic technology. Another would be, you might call it ethical innovations themselves, that made some dispositions, for one reason or another, more objects of praise than before, and which made other ethical dispositions perhaps more self-rewarding than they were before. And as a consequence, you can imagine different things that would affect the supply of ethical dispositions in a community, and that those would vary through time as these various different types of innovations took place. In terms of the diagrams we worked on last time, we could model a couple of effects. In one case, so if we look at this this example from last time, we can see that if we start out with some kind of initial equilibrium, and then there was either a social shock or an ethical innovation that tended to increase the supply of ethical people, that would tend to move this MBE curve up or out, and the result would be an increase in output from in that product. And we last time showed why such an increase in ethical dispositions would have that effect. What we've done today is to show that there are ways you can model this, and even if you think of the development of ethical dispositions as taking place through time, those diagrams we just developed can shed some light on those. In the sense that you could think of families encouraging their kids to to develop particular ethical dispositions because they know they'll be economically rewarded, or because other people in the community will find them to be praiseworthy, or because the individuals themselves, the children themselves, will benefit by having internalized them and feel better about themselves as individuals. And changes that altered family incentives to kind of inculcate these values in individuals in family, and also as people develop and become more engaged themselves directly and consciously in this process of developing ethical dispositions, they too can kind of enhance their own investments later in life, in college and afterwards. In response to changes in the circumstances that they find themselves. And I think I'll stop here for today's lecture, and I'll come back and record another one for Thursday, because I don't expect to be COVID-free on Thursday morning, but you never know. In any case, I'll record it and post it, and these will be available on the eCampus site and on the class website. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope you found it of some interest. See you soon. Bye.